The bells of St. Wyburn's had just finished tolling the hour when Cassandra Whitmore found the basket on the chapel steps, and for the rest of her life she would remember that the cold that morning had a particular quality to it, a stillness so complete that even the frost seemed to be holding its breath. She had come early, as she always did, to sweep the porch before the vicar arrived, and she nearly missed the basket entirely in the grey half-light, tucked as it was into the shadow of the old stone archway. It was only the small sound that stopped her, not quite a cry, more a thin, exhausted whimper, the sound of a creature too cold and too spent to protest properly any longer. And when she knelt and drew back the frost-stiffened blanket, she found a boy of perhaps 4 months. His lips faintly blue, his small hands curled tight against his chest, as though even in sleep he was bracing himself against a world that had already shown him too little kindness. She did not hesitate. Whatever caution a plainer, more careful woman might have exercised, Cassandra had none of it in her that morning. She simply gathered the child against her own body beneath her cloak, felt the shocking chill of him against her skin, and ran the whole distance back to her small rented room above the chandler's shop, with a speed that left the early market goers staring after her. It was only once the boy had been warmed by the fire, fed on borrowed milk from a neighbour's goat, and had finally stopped that terrible thin crying, that Cassandra allowed herself to examine what had been left with him, a linen wrapper of far finer weave than anything she owned herself, and pinned inside it, half hidden in the folds, a small enamelled miniature portrait of a young officer in regimentals, his dark eyes so striking that she found herself staring at the little painted face for a long moment before she noticed the initials, scratched faintly on its reverse, R.G. She had no way of knowing, kneeling there on her cold floor with a stranger's child finally sleeping against her shoulder, that the initials belonged to Captain Richard Grey, only son and heir of Nathaniel Grey, Earl of Ruthmere, dead these 8 months of wounds taken at Corunna, nor that the child in her arms was the last living piece of him, nor that the whole machinery of a great and grieving family had been quietly searching for exactly this small, cold bundle for the better part of half a year. She knew only that she was 26, unmarried, with no family in Milburn to vouch for her beyond a widowed aunt too infirm to be of much use, and that a woman in her position who suddenly produced an infant from nowhere would very shortly find herself with no room above the chandler's shop at all, no mending work from the respectable households that presently kept her fed, and very likely no place left in Milburn willing to have her. Her aunt, when told of it that same afternoon, said exactly what Cassandra had feared she would say. "You must take him to the parish, child, and quickly, before word spreads that you've done otherwise. A woman alone cannot afford this kind of tenderness. I have watched too many good women ruined by exactly this sort of soft-heartedness, and I will not watch it happen to my own sister's daughter." The old woman's eyes were not unkind as she said it, only tired, weighted with the particular caution of someone who had seen too many hard winters to trust in the kindness of strangers, or in the world's willingness to reward it. She had buried a husband young, and raised 2 children alone on very little besides her own stubbornness, and Cassandra understood, even as she resisted the advice, that it came from a place of hard-won experience rather than any want of feeling. "I know what you say is sensible," Cassandra told her, and meant it, for every practical instinct she possessed argued the very same case. "I know precisely what it will cost me to keep him, and yet I find, Aunt Prudence, that I cannot make my arms let go of him, however sensible letting go would be." "Is that so very great a failing in me?" Her aunt studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, however reluctantly. "It is not a failing at all," she said finally. "It is only a kind of courage the world rarely troubles itself to reward. I hope, for both your sakes, that it proves the exception rather than the rule." She said nothing further to dissuade her after that, though she did not offer help either. beyond the loan of a goat's milk and a promise of silence, which was, from a woman as careful as Prudence Thorne, no small gift at all. She kept him anyway. She told the chandler's wife, and through her the whole of the small market town, that the boy was her late cousin's son, sent to her when the fever that had killed his mother left no one else willing to take him in. A story thin enough that she half expected it to be doubted from the very first telling. But grief makes people incurious in ways that scandal does not, and for a time at least. The tale held. She named him Henry, for no reason she could entirely explain, except that it felt like a name a boy could grow safely into, and she did not tell a single soul about the miniature portrait or the initials scratched into its back, which she kept instead in the bottom of her sewing basket, wrapped in a handkerchief, taken out only on the nights when Henry slept soundly enough that she could sit alone by the fire and wonder uselessly who had loved this child enough to leave him something so fine, and been forced by some cruelty or desperation to leave him anyway. She did not have to wonder for very much longer, though she could not have guessed it that first week, watching frost gather on her narrow window while a stranger's son slept warm at last in her arms. The gentleman arrived in Wyburn some 5 weeks later, in the deep cold of January, calling himself Mr. Fairhurst, and claiming business connected to a survey of the county's old coaching roads. He took rooms at the Rothmere Arms, an irony Cassandra would only understand much later. When she learned that the inn had been named, a generation before, for the very family whose lost heir Mr. Fairhurst had actually come to find, and within a fortnight of his arrival, half the town had noticed that his surveying business seemed to require an unusual quantity of loitering near the chandler's shop. He was tall, dark, and carried himself with a controlled stillness that Cassandra found almost unsettling the first time she passed him in the lane. For it was not the stillness of a man with nothing on his mind, but of a man holding a great deal very carefully in check. His clothes were plain enough to pass without remark, yet there was something in the cut of his boots, in the quality of the watch chain he kept tucked always out of easy sight, that made the innkeeper's daughter blush and stammer whenever he addressed her, as though some old instinct in her recognized a rank her eyes could not confirm. Cassandra told herself she had no interest in a stranger's business, and continued telling herself so with decreasing conviction through every accidental meeting that followed, at the baker's stall, where he seemed always to require bread at precisely the hour she did, at the well, where he insisted, despite her protests, on carrying her filled pail the last stretch of the lane, and once, memorably, at the churchyard gate, where she found him standing before her own family's modest headstones, with an expression so unguarded and so sorrowful that she nearly did not announce herself at all, not wishing to trespass on grief that plainly was not meant for an audience. "You are often to be found in places that have very little to do with roads, Mr. Fairhurst," she said to him at last, unable to hold her tongue any longer. One grey afternoon when he had appeared, entirely without plausible reason, at the very corner where she paused each day to let Henry watch the carter's horses pass, something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, not quite alarm, before he answered, with a care that told her the answer had been prepared in advance. "I find the roads of Wyburn considerably less interesting than its people, Miss Whitmore, though I grant you it makes for a poor account to give my employers." His gaze dropped, as it so often did to the child in her arms, and something in his expression sharpened in a way she could not account for. "He has grown, I think, since I first saw him in the market. Children generally do," she said, with more tartness than she intended, though she found, to her own private confusion, that she was fighting a smile rather than offence. "It is thought to be one of their more predictable habits." It should have ended there, a small exchange of dry wit between two near strangers. And yet, Mr. Fairhurst did not walk on as a man with genuine business elsewhere might have done. He lingered, watching Henry reach small fists toward the passing horses, with a fascination the boy showed for very little else, and there was something in the stranger's stillness in that moment, something almost reverent, that made Cassandra's instinct prick, with a suspicion she could not yet name and did not, if she were honest with herself, entirely wish to examine. It was not a suspicion the rest of Milburn shared. To the town at large, Cassandra remained precisely what she had always been, the plain, hard-working seamstress, with a foundling to raise, and no fortune to soften the burden of it. And there were those in the district only too glad to remind her of her place, whenever the opportunity presented itself. She felt it most sharply one market day, some weeks into Mr. Fairhurst's residence at the inn, when Mrs. Cavell, wife of the district's leading landholder, and a woman who had never once in 6 years troubled herself to learn Cassandra's Christian name, stopped her in the square with a smile that carried no warmth in it at all. "I hear the fine gentleman at the Ruthmere Arms has taken quite an interest in your little household, Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Cavell said, her gaze travelling with deliberate slowness from Cassandra's mended cuffs to the plain wool blanket wrapped around Henry. "One does wonder what a man of evident means finds so very absorbing in a seamstress's rooms above a chandler's shop. I confess I should be careful, in your position, of encouraging attentions a woman of your circumstances has very little real hope of seeing honourably concluded." It was said with a smile, and loudly enough that half the stalls nearby fell quiet to listen, and Cassandra felt the old, familiar heat of humiliation rise in her chest. The particular sting of being spoken to as though she were a curiosity, rather than a person with a heart capable of being wounded. She thought, for one unsteady moment, of simply walking on, of swallowing the insult as she had swallowed 100 smaller ones before it. Instead she found, to her own quiet surprise, that something in her had grown too tired of smallness to bow to it any longer. "You are quite right to wonder, Mrs. Cavell," she said, meeting the other woman's eyes without flinching, her voice pitched to carry exactly as far as the insult had. "I wonder myself, most days, what any decent person finds worth their notice in this town, when its finest ladies save their warmest attentions for judging a seamstress's cuffs, rather than asking after the health of the child she has half frozen herself trying to save. I do not know what Mr. Fairhurst sees in my household, madam. I know only that he has never once, in the whole of his acquaintance with me, looked at a mended sleeve and mistaken it for the whole of my worth." She inclined her head with a composure she did not entirely feel and walked on, leaving Mrs. Cavell sputtering behind her, and though her hands shook for a full quarter-hour afterward with the aftermath of her own daring, she found she did not regret a single word of it. She did not know that Mr. Fairhurst himself had been standing near enough to hear the whole exchange, having come to the square on the same thin pretext that brought him everywhere Cassandra happened to be. Nor did she see the look that crossed his face as he watched her walk away with her chin held high and her composure only faintly cracked, an expression that, had she seen it, would have told her far more plainly than any words could have exactly how thoroughly he had already lost the careful battle he had been fighting against his own heart. It was Mrs. Pruitt, the elderly midwife who had once delivered half the infants of Milburn, and buried a fair number of their grandparents besides, who found Cassandra some hours later still faintly trembling from the encounter, and who offered the kind of blunt, unsentimental comfort that suited her far better than any softer words might have. "You did nothing wrong, child, in speaking as you did," the old woman told her, settling herself by the fire with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. "A woman who has done nothing to be ashamed of owes no apology to those too idle to look past a mended sleeve. I have watched this town judge a great many people by far less honest measures than the one you offer that boy each day, and I do not doubt for one moment which of you will be remembered more kindly, when all the fine dinners and finer gowns have long since been forgotten." He did not know, standing in that cold lane, whether the ache rising in his chest was hope or grief dressed up to resemble it. For Nathaniel Gray had chased false hope down a dozen roads already in the months since his son's death, each one ending in nothing but fresh disappointment, and he had promised himself, boarding the coach for Milburn on the strength of nothing more than a laundress's careless remark about a foundling boy taken in near St. Wyburn's, that he would not allow himself to believe again until belief could no longer be denied him. He had buried Richard in the spring, killed in Spain before word ever reached him that his son had married, in secret and against every expectation of his rank, a gentle, clever governess named Isabel Farrow, whose only crime in the eyes of the Grey family had been possessing no fortune and no name worth mentioning in drawing rooms. Nathaniel had learned of the marriage only after his son's death, from a letter Richard had left with his solicitor to be delivered in the event he did not return from the peninsula, and by the time that letter reached him, Isabel herself had already vanished from the small cottage where Richard had settled her, taking with her the infant son Nathaniel had not known existed until it was almost too late to find him at all. The letter itself Nathaniel had by now read so many times that its creases had begun to soften into holes, and he carried it with him always, folded inside his coat, alongside the small miniature of Richard, as a boy that he could not bring himself to leave behind at Ruthmere. He had been, before his son's death, a man well regarded through the county for a certain warmth beneath his natural reserve, quick to forgive a tenant's late rent in a hard year, generous with his time toward any child underfoot at the harvest suppers he had once hosted without fail each autumn. It was that man, buried now beneath a year of grief he could not set down, that he found himself, in his most private and most exhausted hours, hoping he might yet find his way back to becoming, if only he could first undo the single unforgivable thing he had allowed his own household to do, permit talk of Richard's unsuitable match to reach Isabel's ears before he had ever troubled himself to meet her, to judge her for himself, to offer the welcome a son's wife ought by every decent measure to have received. He blamed, in the long silent months that followed, not Isabel for vanishing, nor even fully himself, though guilt gnawed at him none the less for the coldness with which his own household had once spoken of unsuitable matches, comments Isabel might well have overheard before Richard's death ever forced her into hiding. He blamed, most bitterly and most uselessly of all, his nephew Edmund Grey, next in line to the earldom should no direct heir ever be found, a man whose sympathy at Richard's funeral had struck Nathaniel even then as a fraction too smooth, a fraction too well rehearsed for genuine grief, though he had no proof of anything beyond instinct, and a grieving man's instincts, he reminded himself often in those months, were not always to be trusted. It was that instinct, more than any solid intelligence, that had sent him quietly from London to a market town he had never before had reason to visit, travelling under a false name so that no premature hope and no premature scandal might attach itself to a search that could yet come to nothing. He had made this same quiet, hopeless journey to 4 other towns before Milburn, each time on the strength of some thin, second-hand rumour, each time returning to London a little more hollowed out than the last, until even his own solicitor had begun, gently, to suggest that perhaps the kindest thing now would be to let the search rest, to accept that Isabel and the child might never be found, and to allow the earldom's succession to settle, however unhappily, upon Edmund after all. Nathaniel had refused to hear it. He had buried a son already. He would not, while any thread of hope remained however thin, bury the last living piece of him as well without a fight. He had not expected, arriving in Milburn with nothing more than a laundress's rumour to guide him, to find himself standing in a cold lane, watching a plain, sharp-tongued young woman balance a fair-haired infant on her hip. With a tenderness that struck something loose in his chest, he had thought grief had permanently closed off. Nor had he expected that the longer he watched her, the less certain he became of which discovery he had truly come to Milburn seeking. Over the weeks that followed, Mr. Fairhurst became, without either of them quite admitting how it had happened, a fixture of Cassandra's days. He brought no extravagant gifts, for he understood, with an instinct sharper than most men of his rank ever bothered to develop, that a proud woman guards her dignity more fiercely than her comfort, and that gifts too costly would only frighten her away. Instead, he brought small, careful kindnesses, a jar of honey left anonymously with the baker's wife. When he learned Henry had taken a cough, a length of flannel delivered without note the week, a hard frost threatened to freeze the chandler's shop through its thin walls. An hour of his own time spent teaching Henry to grip his finger and pull himself upright. An exercise the boy delighted in far more than any rattle or toy could have provided. There was one evening, in particular, that Cassandra would carry with her for the whole of her life afterward, though she did not know, at the time it occurred, that she had witnessed anything at all. She had left the room only briefly, to fetch water from the landing, and returned to find Mr. Fairhurst seated by the low fire with Henry asleep against his chest, the boy's small fist curled into the folds of his plain coat, and the gentleman himself utterly unaware that he was observed, his head bent low over the sleeping child, murmuring something too soft for her to catch, his other hand resting with a careful, trembling tenderness against the boy's back, as though he were memorizing the exact weight and warmth of him. She stood in the doorway a long moment, unwilling to break whatever private thing was passing between them, watching the firelight play across the two of them with a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames themselves. And it was only when he finally looked up, his eyes bright with an emotion he made no attempt to hide from her, that she understood she had been given, without either of them quite intending it, a glimpse of something far more honest than any of his careful, measured words had yet managed to convey. Whatever else Mr. Fairhurst was hiding beneath his plain coat and his careful reserve, she thought. Watching him gather himself with visible effort back into his usual composure, it was not indifference, not to the child, and increasingly she suspected with a mixture of hope and fear she hardly knew how to hold. Not to her either. You need not pretend these things arrive by chance, Mr. Fairhurst, Cassandra told him one evening, folding a length of flannel she had found upon her doorstep with no explanation attached, though she had recognized, by then, the particular quality of paper his household evidently favored for wrapping such parcels. I have lived too plainly and too long to mistake kindness for coincidence. She set down her mending and studied him a moment, the low firelight catching the tired lines about his eyes, lines she had come, without quite meaning to memorize as carefully as she memorized every small change in Henry's face. A land surveyor does not concern himself with a stranger's teething troubles, nor trouble a county physician on her behalf, nor sit an hour teaching a foundling to stand upright on his own 2 feet. Whatever business truly brings you to Milburn, sir, I think we are long past the point where either of us believes it has much to do with coaching roads. Then you have found me out, he said, and something in his voice, low and entirely without its usual careful reserve, made her look up sharply. I confess I do not know how to stop myself from wishing to ease whatever burdens I am able to, Miss Whitmore, even when I have no earthly right to try. It is not a habit any sensible man ought to cultivate in a stranger's town. It was as near a confession as either of them had yet dared, and it frightened her rather more than it thrilled her, for she had spent 26 years learning precisely how little the world offered a woman of her station, without expecting something costly in return, and she found herself, in the days that followed, holding him at a careful distance even as her heart argued fiercely against the wisdom of doing so. There were evenings she caught herself listening for his step upon the stair, long before any sensible hour for a caller's visit, and mornings she dressed with more care than her errands required, and scolded herself bitterly each time, certain that whoever this careful, watchful gentleman truly was beneath his plain coat, he could want nothing lasting from a seamstress with a foundling child, and no family of consequence to speak for her. And yet he kept returning, through the whole bitter turning of that winter, finding reason after reason to be wherever Cassandra and Henry happened to be, until there grew between them an understanding built less on words than on glances held a moment too long. Silences that felt like companionship rather than awkwardness, and the particular gentleness with which he always greeted the boy first and Cassandra second, as though he understood, without her ever needing to explain it, that the surest path to her guarded heart ran directly through her devotion to the child she had chosen to love, without any promise of return. The turn that changed everything came on the coldest night of that whole hard winter, when Henry fell suddenly and violently ill. It began, as such things so often do, with what Cassandra told herself was merely fretfulness brought on by teething. But by midnight, his small body burned with a fever so fierce it frightened her more thoroughly than anything had frightened her since the morning she first found him on the chapel steps, and his breathing had gone thin and rasping in a way that made her blood run cold, with a fear she had no name gentle enough to speak aloud. She tried every remedy she knew, cool cloths pressed to his brow, a few drops of watered wine coaxed between his cracked lips, the low, steady singing that had always before soothed him back to sleep. And none of it touched the fever at all, which only climbed higher as the small clock on her mantel ticked its way toward the deepest, coldest hour of the night. The hour when even the most rational fears grow teeth. Her neighbor, summoned in a panic, could offer only cool cloths and useless reassurance, murmuring the sort of gentle, hollow comfort people offer when they have privately already begun to fear the worst. And it was in her desperation, past the second hour of that endless night, with Henry's small chest working so hard for each breath, that Cassandra could no longer bear to watch it without her own hands shaking, that she finally ran the length of the frozen high street to the Ruthmere Arms, and pounded on Mr. Fairhurst's door, with a violence that would have scandalized her a week before. He answered, before her second knock had finished falling, already half-dressed, as though some instinct had roused him before her fist ever struck the wood, and he asked no questions at all upon seeing her face. He simply said, "Which way?" and was reaching for his coat before she had finished pointing him toward the lane. What followed was the longest night of Cassandra's life, and the one that laid bare, at last, everything neither of them had yet dared to say. Mr. Fairhurst did not send a servant for the county physician. He rode for the man himself, driving his hired horse through ice-slick roads at a pace that left the animal trembling, and when he returned with the doctor at his side, he did not retreat to wait in some other room like a man with no true stake in the outcome. He stayed. He held the basin of cool water. He sat through the darkest hours of that fever, with a stillness that Cassandra would only later understand had cost him every ounce of composure he possessed, because he did not yet dare hope aloud that the child fighting for breath before him might be the very grandson he had crossed half the country to find. Near dawn, when the fever broke at last and Henry's breathing eased into the steady rhythm of ordinary sleep, Cassandra found herself weeping, not from grief now but from the sheer release of it, and Mr. Fairhurst, without asking leave, without a single word of explanation, drew her gently against his shoulder and let her weep there, his hand steady against her hair, and neither of them spoke of what it meant that he had held her as though she was something he could not now imagine his life without. It was in the hush that followed, with the first grey light creeping through the frost-etched window, and Henry's sleeping sound at last, that he said, very low, "I must tell you something, and I fear it will alter everything you believe of me." Cassandra drew back, some old caution stirring even through her exhaustion. "Then tell me plainly, sir, for I find I have very little patience left tonight for anything less." "My name is not Fairhurst," he said. "It is Grey. Nathaniel Grey, Earl of Ruthmere." He watched her face carefully as the words landed, watched the colour drain from it and then rise again, and pressed on before she could speak. "I did not come to Milburn on any matter of roads or surveys. I came because my son died 8 months ago in Spain, leaving behind a secret marriage and an infant son I never knew existed until it was very nearly too late to find him. His mother vanished before I could reach her. I have searched for them both since, on nothing but rumor and desperation, and a laundress's idle remark led me at last to this town. Cassandra's hand had gone, without her quite meaning it to, toward the handkerchief-wrapped miniature she still kept hidden at the bottom of her sewing basket, and something in her face must have betrayed the thought forming behind it, for he crossed the small room in 2 strides and took her hands in both of his. "There was a portrait," she whispered, "left with him, pinned inside his wrapper, a young officer in regimentals. I could not account for it, and I did not know who to ask without risking everything." "Show me," he said, and his voice was not the voice of an earl accustomed to command. It was the voice of a man standing at the very edge of something he had wanted so desperately, for so long, that he no longer trusted himself to reach for it without breaking. She fetched the miniature with trembling hands, and the moment his eyes fell upon the small painted face, upon the initials scratched faintly into its back, the sound that left him was not quite a word at all, but something rawer than that, something held in check for the better part of a year, finally breaking free at last. He sank into the chair beside the makeshift cradle, and for a long moment could not speak, only look, with an expression of such naked grief and hope together, that Cassandra felt her own heart crack open simply watching it. "That is Richard," he said finally, his voice unsteady in a way she suspected very few people in his life had ever heard from him. "My son. He sat for that portrait the week before he sailed, and gave it, I now understand, to a wife I never had the chance to meet." His hands, when he reached at last to touch the small painted face, trembled visibly. If Isabel left this with him, she meant for someone, someday, to know exactly whose blood he carried. She meant for him to be found. It should have been, Cassandra would think later, a moment of pure and simple joy, and in one sense it was, for she had wondered for weeks who had loved this child enough to leave him something so fine. And now she knew, and the knowing filled some old, aching space in her chest she had not realized was still empty. But beneath the joy came a colder feeling, swift and immediate, and she felt it settle into her stomach like a stone. "You will take him home," she said, and hated how thin her voice sounded in the quiet room. "You will take him to Rothmere, where he belongs by every right of blood, and I—" She could not finish the sentence, could not make herself speak the ending she saw so clearly waiting for her. Nathaniel looked up at her sharply, and whatever he saw in her face seemed to steady something in him, for he rose at once and came to stand before her, close enough that she had to lift her chin to hold his gaze. "I did not come to Milburn only to find my grandson," he said, quiet and certain. "I did not know it myself when first I arrived, but I know it now, and I will not pretend otherwise to spare either of us the discomfort of saying it plainly. I will not tear a child from the arms of the woman who saved his life, and gave him more genuine love in 5 cold weeks than half of London's nurseries manage in a decade. Whatever else comes of this night, Miss Whitmore, I do not intend to leave this town without you both." It was perhaps the most a heart as guarded as hers could be asked to absorb in a single exhausted dawn, and she did not fully believe it, not then, not for weeks afterward, for word travels quickly in a small market town, and it was not a fortnight before the whole of Milburn knew that the seamstress's foundling had turned out to be the long-lost heir of Rothmere. And knowledge of that particular shape has a way of curdling as it passes from mouth to mouth. By the time the story reached the county's more fashionable drawing rooms, it had grown teeth. That Miss Whitmore had known the truth from the very start, that she had angled deliberately for exactly this outcome, that no honest woman simply happened upon a lost earl's heir and an earl's private devotion within the same season, without some contrivance behind it. Cassandra bore the whispers, as she had always borne such things, with a straight back and a carefully composed face. But she found, to her private grief, that they cost her a great deal more now than they ever had before, precisely because she had, for the first time in her life, so very much to lose. She began, in the fortnight that followed Nathaniel's confession, to withdraw from him by careful degrees, declining an invitation to dine with him at the inn's private parlour, answering his calls with a politeness so correct it edged toward coldness, until he arrived one raw afternoon to find her once more occupied elsewhere, and finally pressed her, gently but without retreat, for the truth of what troubled her. "I will not be the ruin of you," she told him at last, the words coming rougher than she had intended, years of careful restraint finally cracking under the weight of what she had been holding back. "I have heard what is said of me, my lord, and I cannot entirely fault them for wondering at it. An earl does not marry a seamstress from a room above a chandler's shop, whatever debt of gratitude he believes he owes her for a night's nursing. I would rather lose you now, while I still have the sense left to bear it, than watch you come slowly to regret a choice made in the heat of one desperate night, and watch Henry grow old enough to hear the whispers too, and wonder whether his grandfather's countess brought him anything but shame." It was, Nathaniel would tell her much later, the only time in the whole of their acquaintance he had seen her come close to weeping from something other than joy or terror for the child, and it broke something open in him that all his earlier caution had kept carefully shut. He did not argue with her fear by dismissing it, for he understood too well, from a year spent buried beneath his own pride and grief, how little good it does to tell a frightened heart it has no right to be afraid. Instead he simply said, "Then let me answer the whispers where they can be heard, rather than let them answer for me in silence," and it was that promise, more than any tender word he might have offered in its place, that began, slowly and carefully, to draw her guard back down. The full shape of what had driven Isabel Farrow into hiding in the first place, and what had finally led her son to a cold chapel step rather than to safety, emerged only once Nathaniel refused to let the matter rest. He brought Cassandra and Henry back with him to Rothmere, not yet as his countess, for he was too careful a man, and had wounded too many people through hastiness already, to rush what deserved patience and full public acknowledgement, but openly, as the guardian of his grandson, and, unmistakably to anyone who observed them together, as the woman he intended to make his wife. The carriage ride itself was the first true glimpse Cassandra had of the world she was about to enter, and she spent the better part of it in a state of quiet, private terror she took great pains not to show, watching the county's neat hedgerows give way to the long, iron-gated approach of a house grander than any she had ever set foot inside, let alone been expected to command as its mistress. Nathaniel, seeming to sense her nerves without her needing to voice them, reached across the carriage and took her hand in his, not with any grand speech attached, but simply holding it steady through the last mile of the drive, as though the gesture alone might lend her some of the courage she feared she lacked. She needn't have worried quite so much over her reception, though she could not have known it in advance. It was there, in the great quiet house that had stood a full year without laughter, that an old housekeeper, moved to indiscretion by the sight of the long-shuttered nursery being aired and warmed once more, let slip the detail that finally set the whole truth unravelling, that Mr. Edmund Grey, the Earl's nephew and, absent any acknowledged heir, next in line to the earldom, had made quiet inquiries after Isabel's whereabouts some months past, inquiries conducted through a solicitor not his own, and concerned rather less with her welfare than with ensuring she never returned to trouble the succession. Even before that detail came fully to light, whispers of doubt had already begun circling Henry's claim, stirred quietly by Edmund himself, who did precisely what men of his sort so often do when the ground threatens to give way beneath their feet. He suggested, to anyone patient enough to listen, that a child found abandoned on a chapel step could hardly be trusted as the true Rothmere heir, and that Miss Whitmore's sudden elevation smelled a great deal more of calculation than of virtue. For a bitter fortnight, Cassandra found herself the subject of exactly the scandal she had feared from the very first morning she carried a stranger's child home beneath her cloak. Edmund's campaign found its most dangerous audience in Nathaniel's own solicitor, a cautious man named Mr. Aldous, who had served the Rothmere family for the better part of 30 years, and who, however reluctantly, could not entirely dismiss the questions Edmund raised. "I do not doubt the child's parentage, my lord, nor Miss Whitmore's honesty," Aldous told Nathaniel privately, in the library at Rothmere, with the careful discomfort of a man delivering unwelcome counsel to a client he genuinely respected. "But the law will require more than a miniature portrait and a mother's instinct before it will confirm young Henry's claim beyond challenge, and Mr. Edmund Grey, whatever his character, is within his rights to demand such proof be produced. I would urge you, my lord, to secure it swiftly, before doubt of any kind has further opportunity to take root." It was proof that very nearly could not be found at all, for Isabel herself had died of a wasting fever some months after leaving Henry in the care of the old nurse who had once attended her, and the parish where she had been buried, in a town some 40 miles distant, had recorded her only under a false name, so thoroughly had she believed her own safety and her son's depended upon vanishing without trace. It was Cassandra, in the end, who thought to ask the one question no one else had troubled to ask, whether the fine linen wrapper found with Henry might itself bear some maker's mark that could be traced, and it was that same length of linen, examined at last by a draper in the county town, who recognized his own long discontinued weave, and more usefully still, recalled precisely which household had ordered a length of it some 2 years before, that provided the thread Mr. Aldous needed to build an account no court would trouble to doubt. Edmund went further still, in his desperation, than even Nathaniel had first anticipated. He sought out the old nurse who had once attended Isabel in her final confinement of grief and hardship, hoping to persuade her, through a careful mixture of coin and quiet threat, to swear that she had been paid to place the child where Miss Whitmore might later claim to discover him by innocent chance. The old woman, whose own conscience had never fully settled since the desperate night she helped carry the boy toward whatever safety could be found for him, refused Edmund outright. And it was her refusal, reported directly to Nathaniel within the day, that gave him the final proof he required of exactly how far his nephew was prepared to go to protect his own claim upon the earldom. He ended it not with fury, though fury would have been his right, but with a public certainty that left no room remaining for doubt. At a gathering of the county's foremost families, called ostensibly to celebrate the recovery of the long-lost Rothmere heir, the great hall at Rothmere filled with more guests than it had seen in the whole of the year since Richard's death. Candlelight catching on silk and jewels, while an undercurrent of whispered speculation ran beneath every polite greeting exchanged at the door. Cassandra had dressed with more care that evening than she had ever dressed for anything in her life, and still felt, standing at the edge of that glittering crowd, every inch the plain seamstress she had been only months before, painfully aware of the eyes that followed her, some curious, some openly unkind. Nathaniel stood before them all, his nephew pale and cornered among the assembled guests, and spoke not as a wounded man defending his private choices, but as one laying plain truth before people who valued honesty above gossip, once it was set squarely before them. "There are those among you," he said, his voice carrying easily without need of raising, "who would have you believe that the woman standing beside me sought advantage in a child's misfortune. I would ask them to consider what advantage any woman finds in carrying a freezing stranger's infant home beneath her own cloak, in a town where such an act could bring her nothing but suspicion and cost, and never gain. I would ask them to consider that she nursed a fevered infant through the darkest night of my life, without once knowing his blood was noble, because to her it made no difference whatsoever. She has my gratitude, my grandson's very life, and, if she will still have me after all I failed to offer her sooner, my hand before every one of you tonight." He turned to Cassandra then, in front of the whole assembled company, and the room that moments before had hummed with whispered doubt fell utterly, completely silent. "I would rather stand disgraced beside honesty than celebrated beside cruelty, and I know precisely which of the two has occupied this room tonight. Edmund Grey left the county before the season was out, his ambitions and his reputation both in ruins, and no one among that assembled company ever again dared question, even in the quietest whisper, the character of the woman who had saved the Ruthmere Heir. Mr. Aldous himself, who had once counselled caution above all else, was heard to remark to a fellow guest before the evening's end that he had rarely, in 30 years of service to the family, witnessed a man defend a woman's honour with such complete and unhesitating conviction, nor witnessed a woman receive such a defence with quite so little vanity, as though she had simply been waiting, all her life, for someone to finally see her plainly and find her worth the trouble. What followed was not swift, for Nathaniel was too careful a man to rush what deserved patience, and had learned too bitter a lesson already about what haste and pride together could cost a family. He courted Cassandra properly, through the slow turning of that winter into spring, with a devotion the whole county came in time to remark upon. Not grand gestures meant for show, but the quieter kind, a chair drawn always close to hers by the fire, a hand offered before she had need to ask for it, an unwavering presence at Henry's side. Through every small illness a growing child endures, and above all, a patience with her own lingering fear that happiness of this size could not truly be meant for a woman the world had spent 26 years teaching to expect so very much less. There were setbacks, even in that gentle season of courtship, for old habits of guardedness do not surrender themselves easily, however sincerely they are courted out of hiding. Cassandra found herself, more than once, drawing back from some small tenderness, a hand held a moment too long, a compliment offered too plainly, simply because she had not yet learned to trust that such moments were not in fact the prelude to some eventual withdrawal, some quiet realization on Nathaniel's part that a countess ought to be found among his own rank rather than raised up so, improbably from a chandler's rented room. He never once grew impatient with her caution, though she watched him, on occasion, visibly restrain some sharper word in favor of a gentler one, and it was that restraint, that evident effort made purely for her sake, that did more to earn her trust than any grand declaration could have managed alone. He asked her formally in the library at Ruthmere, filled as it was with the particular hush of afternoon light through tall windows, and the scent of old leather that reminded her, oddly, of that first frozen morning at the chapel, though she could not have said precisely why. He did not kneel with any great ceremony, for he understood her well enough by then to know that grandness was not the language her guarded heart best understood. He simply took both her hands in both of his, and said, "I have spent the better part of a year learning what it costs a man to let pride and grief stand where love ought to stand instead. And I do not intend to make that mistake a second time in my life. I do not ask you to be my countess, merely because Henry requires a mother, though heaven knows he could have no finer one. I ask because I can no longer imagine a single morning of my remaining life in which you are not the very first thing I think of." Cassandra, who had rehearsed a dozen cautious, sensible answers in the sleepless nights leading up to that afternoon, found in the moment that none of them were true. "I have spent so very long expecting so little," she told him, her voice unsteady, "that I hardly know how to answer a man who offers me everything at once." She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face, at the hope and fear so plainly written there, despite all his usual composure, and found that whatever fear still lingered in her own heart had quietly, somewhere in the course of that winter, stopped being stronger than her love for him. And then, because his face had begun to fall at what he mistook for hesitation, she laughed, a startled, joyful sound that surprised them both entirely, and said, "Yes, Nathaniel, yes, before you talk yourself into believing I meant anything otherwise." They were married at St. Wyburn's, at Cassandra's own quiet insistence, rather than in some grander chapel at Rothmere alone, for she wished the very steps where a frightened, freezing boy had once been left to find whatever mercy the world might offer him to witness too. Exactly what mercy had grown into. Henry, too young yet to grasp the day's significance, was held throughout the whole ceremony in Cassandra's arms, reaching delighted hands toward the candlelight, as though the family had determined from the very start that he would never again be parted from the woman who had chosen him first, when he had nothing at all to offer her in return. Aunt Prudence stood among the small gathering of witnesses with an expression of such open astonishment that Cassandra nearly laughed aloud in the middle of her own vows, and afterward, when the ceremony had concluded and the modest wedding breakfast was under way in the vicarage parlour, the old woman took her niece's hands in both of her own and said, with tears she made no effort to disguise, "I told you to take him to the parish, that first cold morning. I have never in my life been so glad to see my own advice go entirely unheeded." She glanced toward where Nathaniel stood, Henry balanced easily on his hip, laughing at something the boy had done, and shook her head slowly. "Your mother would have wept to see this day, child. I confess I very nearly have myself." Even Mrs. Cavell, present among the county families invited to the larger celebration held at Rothmere itself the following week, offered Cassandra a stiff, uncomfortable curtsy and a murmured word of congratulation that fooled no one present, least of all Cassandra, though she accepted it with a graciousness that cost her nothing at all to extend. For she found, standing now in the great hall of the house that had become her home, that she had very little appetite left for old grievances, and a great deal more interest in the warm, ordinary future stretching out before her. In the years that followed, the great house at Rothmere, which had stood cold and grieving for so long, filled again with the ordinary precious noise of a family restored. Henry's boots thundering down corridors that had known only silence, his laughter carrying into rooms that had very nearly forgotten the sound of it, and Cassandra's steady, unshaken presence at the center of it all, no longer the overlooked seamstress of a small market town, but a woman who had, through nothing more than an open door on the coldest morning of her life, and a heart too stubborn to guard itself entirely against love, become the very thing that great house had needed most in order to become whole again. Nathaniel would say, in later years, whenever anyone asked how he had found his countess, that he had gone searching for a lost grandson, and found instead the one thing his careful, grieving heart had never truly let itself hope to find again. A woman who loved without calculation, who had chosen a stranger's son when no one at all was watching to reward her for it, and who had taught a broken Earl, in the end, that the truest inheritance any family could hold was not a title, nor a painted portrait, nor a name recorded in a parish register, but the plain courage to open a door when every careful instinct might have counseled keeping. It closed. Henry grew in the years that followed into a boy who knew nothing of scarcity or fear, who ran the length of Rothmere's long galleries with a freedom his own mother had scarcely dared hope for him on the desperate night she first entrusted him to a stranger's care, and who would in time be told the whole of his beginning, not as a shameful secret to be guarded, but as the truest proof his parents could offer him of what love, freely given without any promise of return, was capable of building out of the wreckage of grief and fear. Nathaniel made certain, long before the boy was old enough to fully understand it, that he grew up knowing the name of the woman who had first opened her door to him on that frozen morning, not merely as the mother who had raised him, but as the very reason he had lived at all to be raised by anyone. There came, some years later, a second child, a daughter this time, born in the warmth of a Ruthmere summer rather than the bitter cold that had marked her brother's arrival into the family, and it was often remarked upon by the household staff, in the fond, familiar way of servants who have watched a family knit itself back together, that the Earl of Ruthmere had become, in his own household at least, an entirely unrecognizable man from the cold, silent figure who had once wandered his own galleries alone. He was found more often than not with a child on each knee, or trailing after Henry's small explorations of the stables, with a patience the old Nathaniel would scarcely have credited in himself, and Cassandra, watching him from across whatever room they happened to occupy, found that her own heart still caught, even years into their marriage, at the particular tenderness with which he looked toward his family, as though he could not quite believe, even now, that such happiness had truly been allowed to him. Cassandra never did forget the particular stillness of that frozen January morning, nor the thin, exhausted cry that had called her out onto the chapel steps, and she found, in the quiet moments of her new and far larger life, that she did not wish to forget them. They had been, after everything that followed, the truest measure she had ever been given of her own heart. Proof that the plain, overlooked seamstress of Milburn had never truly been small at all, only waiting, as so many overlooked hearts are, for a morning cold enough and a cry small enough to show the world, and to show herself, exactly what she had always been capable of. She returned, every year on the anniversary of that morning, to the chapel steps of St. Wyburn's, often with Henry beside her, now old enough to understand something of the story, even if its full weight would not settle upon him until he was grown, and she would stand there a moment in whatever weather the day brought, remembering the particular cold of that first frost, the particular stillness before the bells, and the particular courage it had taken a frightened practical woman to kneel down anyway and gather up whatever the world had left, unwanted, upon her doorstep. "Why do we come here every year, Mama?" Henry asked her once, old enough by then to wonder, tugging at her gloved hand as the bells above them began their familiar tolling. Cassandra looked down at him for a long moment, at the dark eyes so like his father's, at the sturdy, laughing boy he had grown into from the cold, silent bundle she had once carried home beneath her cloak, and she thought of a dozen answers before she settled, at last, on the truest one she knew. "Because this is where I learned," she told him, drawing him close against the cold, "that the bravest thing a person can ever do is open a door not knowing what it will cost them, and trust that whatever waits on the other side is worth the risk of loving it." And in the great house at Ruthmere, where laughter had once seemed a thing the walls had entirely forgotten how to hold, it never again had cause to be forgotten.